Timeless Quotes by Jane Austen. The Wisdom Behind the Pages, Part 2. In a small town nestled among the lush green hills of the English countryside, where time seemed to flow slower than in the rest of the world, there stood an old bookstore named The Whispering Pages. It wasn't a large or famous establishment, but it housed a treasure trove of literary gems that its owner, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, had spent her entire life collecting. Margaret believed that every book had a soul of its own, waiting patiently to be discovered by a reader. Love classic literature? Subscribe to classic quotes that inspire now, and let timeless wisdom transform your everyday life. Margaret, a woman in her 70s with silvery white hair and eyes as bright as stars, often sat behind the counter, rereading her favorite classic works. She was particularly enamored with Jane Austen, and the famous quote, "The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid," was a guiding principle in her life, one she often repeated with conviction. However, not everyone shared her passion. In this town, there was a wealthy family, the Harringtons, who prided themselves on their social standing and affluence. Mr. Charles Harrington, a successful businessman, along with his wife Eleanor, viewed reading novels as a waste of time. They believed fiction was for dreamers and insisted their children focus on more practical pursuits like money, fame, and social connections. Their youngest daughter, Emily Harrington, 19 years old, was the perfect embodiment of their ideals. Intelligent, graceful, and always polite, Emily appeared flawless on the surface. But beneath her polished exterior, she felt empty. Her life revolved around parties, social gatherings, and strict instructions from her parents. She had never been allowed to make choices for herself, not even when it came to hobbies like reading. One summer afternoon, as golden sunlight filtered through the leafy canopy shading the road leading into town, Emily decided to escape her parents' watchful eyes and wander alone. She didn't know why she chose this particular path, but something inexplicable drew her toward The Whispering Pages. As soon as she stepped inside, Emily sensed the unique atmosphere. The space was quiet, filled with the scent of aged paper mingled with the faint aroma of lavender. Mrs. Margaret was sitting in the corner, engrossed in an old leather-bound book. When the doorbell chimed, she looked up and smiled warmly. "Welcome, young lady," she said in a gentle tone. "You seem like someone who loves books." Emily hesitated, feeling slightly awkward. "Actually, I'm not sure. I haven't read many books." Mrs. Margaret chuckled softly. "Don't worry, my dear. Everyone starts somewhere. Let me help you find something suitable." After a brief conversation, Mrs. Margaret handed Emily a novel by Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. "This is a wonderful place to begin," she said. "If you don't enjoy it, we'll find something else for you." Emily took the book, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension. She had never imagined herself reading a novel, but Mrs. Margaret's enthusiasm made it impossible to refuse. That night, Emily brought Pride and Prejudice home and hid it carefully under her pillow to avoid detection. When the house grew silent and everyone was asleep, she opened the book and began to read. At first, she struggled with the archaic language and complex writing style, but gradually, the story began to captivate her. She was drawn into Elizabeth Bennet's world, a smart, strong-willed young woman unafraid to challenge societal prejudices. Emily had never met anyone like Elizabeth in real life, and this both fascinated and inspired her. She also saw glimpses of herself in Elizabeth, a young woman constrained by familial and societal expectations. Over the following nights, Emily couldn't tear herself away from the book. She devoured each page with fervor, losing track of time and even forgetting to eat. By the time she finished the novel, she felt as though she had embarked on an incredible journey. Yet, a sense of emptiness lingered within her. She wanted more, to explore new stories and worlds beyond the pages of Pride and Prejudice. One morning, as Emily folded the book after another long night of reading, her mother, Mrs. Eleanor, entered her room unexpectedly. Seeing the book on the desk, Mrs. Eleanor frowned. "What is this?" she asked coldly. Emily tried to stay calm. I just borrowed it from the library." The library? Mrs. Eleanor repeated, disdain dripping from her voice. I thought I taught you that novels are worthless. You should spend your time on more important things, like learning how to manage a household or understanding social relationships. Emily bowed her head, too intimidated to argue. But inside, she seethed with anger. Why did her mother have the right to dictate what she should do? Why was her joy deemed meaningless? From that day on, Emily became more cautious. She hid her books in the most discreet places, underneath old suitcases, in drawers filled with knickknacks, and even inside winter coat pockets. Whenever she visited the Whispering Pages, she chose compact books that were easy to conceal and smuggle home without being caught. During one of her visits to the bookstore, Emily met a young man named Thomas Bennet. Around 25 years old, he had tousled brown hair and piercing blue eyes. Thomas was a village schoolteacher who frequented the shop to borrow books. Though his appearance was simple, he exuded wisdom and kindness. "Oh, so you're fond of Jane Austen too?" Thomas asked, noticing sense and sensibility in Emily's hands. Emily nodded shyly. "Yes, I've only started recently. I think I really like it." Thomas smiled. "So do I." Jane Austen has a way of making you feel like you're part of the story. She understands people and society so well. They spent the entire afternoon chatting, discussing characters, plots, and the profound lessons Jane Austen conveyed through her works. Emily felt at ease talking to Thomas, something she rarely experienced with anyone else. Their meetings soon became routine. Together, they explored literature, exchanged opinions, and delved into the vast world of books. Over time, Emily realized that Thomas wasn't just a good friend. He was the only person who truly understood and supported her passion. Unfortunately, Emily's newfound happiness didn't last long. One day, while she was conversing with Thomas outside the bookstore, Mr. Charles Harrington happened to walk by. He stopped, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Emily, what are you doing here?" he demanded sternly. Startled, Emily quickly stammered, I was just buying some things, Father." Mr. Charles glanced at Thomas, then turned back to Emily. "And who is this?" Thomas stepped forward politely and bowed his head. "Sir, my name is Thomas Bennet. I'm a teacher at the local school. Emily and I share an interest in books." "An interest in books?" Mr. Charles repeated mockingly. "That's no way to spend your time. Emily, go home immediately." Humiliated and furious, Emily shot Thomas an apologetic look before reluctantly following her father home. That evening, she faced her parents' wrath. They forbade her from seeing Thomas again and ordered her to focus on her responsibilities. Emily Harrington had always felt suffocated by her family's rigid expectations. Her parents, Charles and Eleanor Harrington, were pillars of propriety in their small English town. A couple whose lives revolved around social status, wealth accumulation, and maintaining appearances. To them, reading novels was frivolous at best and dangerous at worst. Novels encouraged dreaming, introspection, and questioning, things they feared would undermine Emily's ability to fulfill her duties as a proper young woman. But after discovering Pride and Prejudice, something inside Emily shifted. For the first time, she understood what Jane Austen meant when she penned that immortal line. "The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid." It wasn't just about enjoying a good story. It was about recognizing the depth and complexity of human nature. Novels weren't mere distractions. They were mirrors reflecting society, critiques of inequality, and explorations of universal truths. Yet, convincing others of this truth proved challenging. After the heated argument with her father over Thomas Bennet and her love for literature, Emily resolved to fight back. Not with anger, but with intellect. She began crafting a plan to demonstrate how literature could shape minds, inspire change, and even challenge societal norms. Over the next few weeks, Emily immersed herself in books borrowed from Margaret Whitmore's shop. Each day, she returned home with new insights, eager to share them with anyone willing to listen. Unfortunately, her parents remained stubbornly dismissive. They saw no value in tales of fictional characters navigating made-up worlds. But Emily refused to let their narrow-mindedness deter her. One afternoon, while flipping through Sense and Sensibility, Emily stumbled upon a passage where Marion Dashwood laments the constraints placed upon women in society. The words struck a chord deep within her. We are told we must suppress our passions, curb our desires, and live according to rules set by men who neither understand nor care about us. Emily underlined the sentence with trembling hands. These were sentiments she'd never dared express aloud. Yet here they were, articulated so beautifully by Austen. Suddenly, she realized that her struggle against her parents' control wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern woven into the fabric of history. Women like Marianne, Elizabeth Bennet, and countless others before her had faced similar battles. And though their victories were often small, they mattered. Inspired, Emily decided to write letters, not to her parents, but to Thomas. In these letters, she poured out her thoughts, dreams, and frustrations. Writing became her refuge, a way to process emotions she couldn't voice face to face. Through their correspondence, she and Thomas grew closer, bonding over shared ideals and literary musings. As Emily delved deeper into her newfound passion, Thomas continued to play a pivotal role in her journey. One evening, during one of their clandestine meetings at the Whispering Pages, he shared another chapter of his life, one that further illuminated the transformative power of literature. When I was 16, Thomas began, his voice soft but steady. I read Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Do you know it? Emily shook her head. No, I haven't read it yet. It's a masterpiece, he said, smiling wistfully. It tells the story of Jean Valjean, a man imprisoned for stealing bread to feed his starving family. After serving 19 years, he emerges broken and bitter, only to encounter kindness from a bishop. That single act of compassion changes him forever. He dedicates his life to helping others, all while evading capture by Inspector Javert, who believes justice demands unwavering punishment. Thomas paused, gazing thoughtfully at the flickering candlelight. Reading Les Miserables taught me that redemption is possible, even for those society deems irredeemable. It showed me that mercy can triumph over judgment, and that every person deserves a second chance. He turned to Emily, his eyes shining with conviction. That book changed my perspective on life. Before reading it, I resented my circumstances. I blamed fate for making me poor and powerless. But Jean Valjean's story reminded me that I have a choice, to succumb to bitterness or to rise above it. Literature gave me hope when I needed it most. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she listened. She realized that Thomas's connection to literature mirrored her own. Both of them had found solace, inspiration, and courage in stories written centuries ago. Those stories transcended time and space, speaking directly to the heart. Despite her growing confidence, Emily knew she couldn't keep defying her parents indefinitely. Their disapproval weighed heavily on her, especially since she loved them deeply despite their flaws. Determined to bridge the gap between them, she devised a bold strategy. One Sunday afternoon, Emily invited her parents to join her for tea in the garden. When they arrived, they found a table adorned with books, some familiar, others unfamiliar. Among them were classics like Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Little Women, alongside modern works by authors such as Virginia Woolf and George Orwell. What is the meaning of this? Mrs. Harrington asked, raising an eyebrow. I want to show you something, Emily replied calmly. Please sit down. Give me just 30 minutes of your time. Reluctantly, her parents complied. Over the next half hour, Emily read excerpts from various novels, explaining their relevance to real-life issues. She quoted from Jane Eyre, "Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong." Then she connected Bronte's protagonist to contemporary debates about gender equality. From 1984, she cited Orwell's warning about totalitarianism. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. She argued that understanding dystopian fiction helped people recognize threats to freedom in their own world. Finally, she returned to Jane Austen, reciting the now familiar quote, "The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel, must be intolerably stupid. With a gentle smile, she added, I don't believe either of you are stupid, but perhaps you've simply never given novels a fair chance. Her parents exchanged uneasy glances. Though they didn't admit it outright, Emily sensed a shift in their demeanor. Maybe they wouldn't embrace her passion overnight, but at least they seemed willing to reconsider their stance. Months passed, and Emily's persistence paid off. Slowly but surely, her parents began tolerating, if not appreciating, her love for books. Mr. Harrington occasionally picked up a novel, albeit reluctantly, while Mrs. Harrington surprised everyone by recommending Anne of Green Gables to a neighbor. Meanwhile, Emily and Thomas continued to nurture their friendship, which blossomed into romance. Together, they dreamed of opening a community library where everyone, regardless of class or background, could access great works of literature. In the end, Emily proved that novels weren't merely entertainment. They were tools for empathy, education, and empowerment. As she stood among shelves filled with beloved books, watching townsfolk lose themselves in stories, she knew she'd succeeded in honoring Jane Austen's timeless wisdom. And so, the legacy of literature lived on, inspiring generations to come. After watching this video, which quote or lesson from Jane Austen's works resonates with you the most? How does it inspire you to see the world differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective.